measure it, and why is it always in constant motion? And when that motion is changed, we get into things like inflation and unemployment, and that's not the good thing. So let's move on. Thinking Like an Economist is the title of chapter 2 in your book. So economists, what they do is they analyze the economy or elements of the economy, and they try to predict what's going to happen. And it's based on observing empirical evidence, statistics basically, and forming from those statistics a method of trying to determine what's going to happen next, what the direction of the economy is, and establish what their assumptions should be in establishing what the economy is going to do. There are basically two models that they use. One is called the circular flow diagram, and the other is the production possibilities curve. The circular flow diagram is more or less used to determine gross domestic product in the economy. It can be calculated through 4 elements of the economy: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. It can be also calculated through income, profits, wages, rents, etc., that are reported to the IRS on a regular basis. And that's how Department of Commerce releases its statistics on the economy and gross domestic product, both the value of gross domestic product and the growth from year to year or quarter to quarter. The second method is the production possibilities curve, or better yet, sometimes called the frontier, the production possibilities frontier. It represents a curve that represents or is the maximum that a company or a country can produce of given products. I'm going to give you several examples of production possibilities curves, how they work, how various economies have gotten themselves in trouble not understanding how this works. So, economics and economics study and economists develop what's called principles. The economy and measuring the economy is not a science. It's not like chemistry, where you put 2 elements together in the same quantities, add something else, and a reaction happens. And it will happen exactly the same every single time. That's not the case for economics. So what we develop in economics are principles. And all of those principles are used to determine a forecast. At the time a forecast is done, the economist will say, you know what? I think this is accurate, but based on if all these things that I've assumed happen as I predicted they would, then I think this forecast is pretty good. But the real truth is, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, I think this is a good forecast. Microeconomics. This is the study of the individual, the household, the business itself, how households and businesses work together, how they behave, how they act in the economy. That's what microeconomics is concerned about. It's easy to remember the difference between micro and macro. Micro represents the smaller units, the individual, household, where macro is a study of the whole economy. We use the term aggregate. Aggregate stands for total. Total of all individuals, households, and businesses in the economy. And that's what we measure in macroeconomics, and that's what we study. One of the keys that I mentioned in economists in determining how the economy is going to operate is the circular flow diagram. This is also in your book. And basically what it says is that you look at the inner circle and you start with households, and you see that households provide the factor market. Don't let the term factor market scare you. It's the place where businesses buy the things they need. So the factor market, we as households deliver land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. Companies take those factors of production, bring them into their business, and with those factors of production, put them together in the lowest possible cost combination and reduce or sell goods and services in the product market. The key to that process is that the lowest cost producer is the one that's going to sell the most and be the most successful. He then provides, or in the producer market, he provides goods and services which we as households have the ability to buy. On the outer circle, you'll see what happens in the product and then also in the consumer market. Start with what in the producer market, what we do is we buy products from businesses and that creates revenue. And in order to produce that product, they incur costs. Now, they buy those costs in the factor market from households. In return for those costs, they pay for it. Money, income, wages, rents, etc. go back into the households. That then enables these households to consume or buy the products that the companies offer in the product marketplace. So it's always a circular flow. That circular flow is continuing on throughout the year, throughout the day, 24/7. If there are interruptions in that circular flow, we have problems that we cause inflation or unemployment. So what we look for is that circular flow to continue on a really growth type of basis. And we'll talk about that more later. Two important acronyms you need to know. One, GDP. Gross domestic product. Using either the expenditure method or the consumption method or income method, we can determine what the gross domestic product of the United States or any country is. And it consists of pretty much three main things. So gross domestic product is equal to what we consume, meaning us as consumers. Investments, gross investments that we as consumers make in businesses, and also government spending. Now, government spending is not priming the pump or it's not putting money into the economy. It's what they buy and need to run the government, computers, pencils, papers, etc. So they're acting like a consumer just like we are. Secondly is the purchasing power parity. This is used in many cases by international organizations, primarily International Monetary Fund, to give a true measure of what the cost of goods and services are between countries. The problem that these entities like the International Monetary Fund have is that the exchange rates that are established on the marketplace are fluctuating continually. And they may not represent the true cost of the currency and or the cost of the products. So what they've come up with is a basket of goods approach to determine what the real exchange rate is based on the possibility or the probability of purchasing the same product in different countries. The example I've given you here is, let's say a flat screen TV in the US is $1,000, but in India it's 4,000 rupees. Then using that basket of goods with the TV set in it, the exchange rate would therefore be $1 equals 4 rupees, or 1 rupee is equal to 25 cents US. Those statistics then are used to compare gross domestic product by country around the world. And the International Monetary Fund publishes that information. All right, society's resources and the factors of production. There are four key elements. Land, which includes natural resources. Water is very important, but it also includes the land that factories are built on, the ability of people to grow crops, etc. So land is one of them. The second is labor. That's us. The contribution that we give to companies and firms to produce goods and services by virtue of the labor that we engage in on a factory floor, in a company, in a school, etc. Thirdly, is capital. This is the money needed to purchase the natural resources, to buy the individuals that produce the goods and services, and pay those individuals. The money is needed to purchase natural resources. It's needed to purchase the land. It's needed to purchase heavy machinery. It's needed to pay individuals that produce these goods and services, the labor, hourly rates, etc. Lastly is entrepreneurial ability. Here's the guy that looks at what has to be done, combines land, labor, and capital to produce the goods and services to make an economy run. He's the innovator, he's the decision maker, he's the risk taker, and these type of people are Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, most recently, of course, Zuckerberg, who's probably worth $63 billion. These are the entrepreneurs that put this stuff together, come up with an idea, take a whole bunch of risk, borrow money from friends, relatives, etc. But they are committed to making their product and making it work and selling it in the marketplace. Henry Ford, for instance, before he was able to successfully bring Ford Motor Company to fruition, went bankrupt 3 times. These people don't give up. They keep pushing their dream, and eventually they are successful. Not everybody is successful, but quite a few people are. Here he is. Here's the guy. He's got the idea. He pulls together the money. It may not be his money. He may have to borrow from banks. He may have to sell stock on the stock market. He may have to borrow from relatives, etc. He may have to borrow on credit cards. He may open up his garage and start building product in his garage. So this is the entrepreneur, and he's key to this whole process. All right, let's talk about the production possibilities curve, or the production possibilities frontier. The curve shows the combination of goods and services an economy can produce at full employment, fixed supplies, and fixed technology. In other words, it represents the equilibrium point between products that represent not only the maximum we can produce at that point in time, but also if we're producing less than that curve, we have a situation where we have unemployment. We can't produce beyond the curve because we don't have the employment, the supplies, or the technology to produce beyond the curve. So a point under the curve represents unemployment. A point beyond the curve is unachievable. All right, the shape of the curve depicts the law of increasing opportunity costs. I'm going to go into this a little bit more in class because it's easy to draw diagrams on the board to show you how this works. But basically what it says is that if I have 2 products and I want to produce more of one, I have to give up something of the other. And we'll look at that in diagram form when you get into class next week. All right, production of 1 more unit will result in an increase in the marginal cost of that product. Think about the example of a factory producing 100,000 units a year. If the manager of that product or that firm or the boss of that firm decides, well, let's produce 10,000 more and sell more. And that's his goal. So he's doing approximately 100,000 a year. He adds 10,000 more. And the problem he's going to have is that 10,000 more is going to cost more than all per unit than all the sum of the 100,000 put together on a per unit basis. Now, why is that? Well, what's he got to do in order to fix that is he's got to look at the reason why he needs to improve that product. If, for instance, he needs to produce 10,000 more, he can't hire any more people because there's no more labor. He can't add any more supplies because there are none. His technology changes are going to take time. So what he has to do in order to produce more is pay more to employees. He's got to add a shift. If he can, he's got to add hours. He's got to do anything he can in order to produce that additional 10,000 products. Now, if he does that, he's going to get into an overtime situation. In Texas, it's 40 hours per week. And what he's got to do then is pay time and a half. So in the short run, you can produce beyond the production possibilities curve, but in the long run, you won't be able to stay profitable. Now, unemployment, again, as I said, causes the economy to operate inside the curve. If we've got unemployment, we're not at full employment, and we're on the inside of the curve. And again, I'll show you how that works when we go into class next week. All right. Additionally, though, we can improve or get more product into a country through international trade. We're limited in what we can produce domestically, but if we decide to engage in free trade or international trade, we can bring in products additionally over and above our production possibilities or our production frontier. This is what the curve looks like. This example is a firm that can produce blue jeans and fire engines. If you follow the curve at the top, you would be producing nothing but blue jeans, where that curve intersects the axis. On the bottom, under fire engines, where the curve intersects that axis, you would be producing nothing but fire engines. But any place along that curve, you would have a combination of either blue jeans or fire engines to produce. So let's say you wanted to produce 2 more fire engines. You would have to give up producing some amount of blue jeans. That is the opportunity cost. That's the cost you're going to pay to produce 2 additional fire engines. You're not going to be able to produce as many blue jeans as you were before. So that is the opportunity cost of producing more of one versus the other. Here's an example of a factory, snowboards versus skis. And you see what this company is doing for alpine sports. They have one plant, they add a second plant, they add a third plant. That becomes their production possibilities curve for those 2 products with 3 plants operating. Now, one of the keys to moving that curve, you'll see on the graph that's presented here, we have capital on one axis and consumption on the other. So what we see then is, how do we move the curve? Now, moving that curve, the blue line to the red line, represents growth in the economy. In order to move that curve, you have to have something that moves it outside of where it is currently. This is called growth. That blue curve would be GDP before, and the red curve would be GDP after. So what we've done is we've increased the value of our economy, we've added more jobs, we've grown, and we have a much more robust economy. Now, how do you accomplish that? Primarily through technology. Technology is the key. From 1950 to the current day, our technology has grown by leaps and bounds. And that has been the reason for our great, tremendous growth that's occurred in the last several years. Here's another example of how the curve has moved out. You'll see point B is on the blue curve, point C is on the red curve, which is the new production possibilities curve. Point A represents a point where we are experiencing unemployment. B and C, of course, are on the curve. Now, if you had a point called D and it was outside the red line, that would not be possible. Okay. All right, let's talk about some pitfalls in economic thinking and the way economists present information. We've got to be careful about how information is passed on to us about the economy, because it can lead us to erroneous conclusions. One of the problems that economists have is bias. The problem that a lot of people have is that we're all human. So the economist thinks, I really think the economy is going to grow by 4%. In doing his research, he may look for things that support his argument that the economy is going to grow by 4%. That's unfortunate. That kind of puts a bias in the thinking. It puts a bias in the forecast, and it may mislead the country into thinking things are different than they actually are. Other problems are when you see terminology. Be careful of the media. Look for words that are opinion, not analysis. For instance, if you see the word greed, oh, those greedy people on Wall Street caused the Great Recession. Or the word obscene, that CEO is making an obscene amount of money. Or exploitative, those guys that run those companies, they're not paying their factory workers enough. They're exploiting their labor. Bureaucrat, someone who has to push a lot of people and doesn't really contribute anything. A socialist, someone who's aggressively trying to redistribute income, take from the rich, give to the poor. A radical, someone who doesn't believe the system is the way it should be, so therefore I am going to change it by radical action. There's also a fallacy of composition. Sometimes we look at things and we say, if this works and it's good, it must be good for everyone. That's called fallacy of composition. Post hoc fallacy. Event A precedes B, therefore A was the cause. Not necessarily true. It can lead to assumptions that are incorrect. And lastly, correlation, not causation. Sometimes we try to correlate things one to another and they don't correlate. We think that, for instance, S&P 500 increases, then the value of gold will automatically decrease. That's not necessarily true. They may be correlated, but one doesn't cause the other. All right, just as a side note, Wall Street Journal had an article in May of 2016, and it was dealing with this whole issue of what economists have to say and how they say it. And his thesis was economists need to be humble and they need to be forthright. And they need to, most importantly, admit what they don't know. Many make bold claims, and the reason they do it is to get on the front page of the newspapers, particularly the Wall Street Journal. So make a bold claim and make a name for yourself. When the White House calls and asks how many jobs a new agenda will create, what should the answer be? The answer should be, we'll get that answer, but here are some things that could happen. Here's our best guess. Here is the likelihood of that happening. Certitude in things that aren't really certifiable is not a good position to take. Understand that things change. We're dealing with human nature, and we cannot predict what a human person or group of people will do in an econometric business model, computer analysis, whatever. Again, remember, we're always dealing with people. So the position, the statements would lend itself to partisan point scoring. Again, support Republican versus Democrat, or Democrat versus Republican. Issue statements that support independence, etc. So, advantages, as this gentleman says in his article, might be to be honest. Tell the truth. Honesty is always the best policy. All right, market system and circular flow. Economic systems. Let's talk about what economic systems we have in this world today. Originally, Adam Smith wrote a book called, what was it called? Hang on, I'll get to it in a minute. Anyway, his book was all about laissez-faire capitalism, or pure capitalism. And the thesis was, let it be. And this was a message to government saying, stay away from the economy, it'll be fine. So equilibrium is achieved by an invisible hand, market forces. Now, the market forces that occur in this world or in any economy or in any market are four things. We have supply, we have demand, we have price, and we have quantity. The interaction of buyers and sellers in that marketplace determine the price that's going to be sold of that product. That's called the invisible hand. So what our friend said was, let's make sure that government only does one thing, and that is it protects private property. On page 34, there's an index of economic freedoms, which by country, US is number 10, just something for you to look at. But Adam Smith said, let's let the government protect private property and prevent theft. Establish, therefore, a legal framework, the rule of law. If I write a contract with you and I agree to pay you 12 months from now, then that is a binding contract, and the government is there to enforce that contract if you do not fulfill your obligations as part of that contract. So Adam Smith recognizes that he needed some sort of legal framework in order for things to work, called the rule of law. In other words, economic environment in which transactions between parties have to be free from government interference. They can't restrict transactions, they can't impose tariffs, they can't subsidize certain things that they may want to. Their only regulations should be to protect private property. Now, you have to remember, when Adam Smith wrote his book, this is in 1776, and the only real industry we had was farming and agriculture. We were still in the agricultural mode. We had not gone through industrialization. So, the name of the book I couldn't remember a minute ago, popularized by Adam Smith in 1776, was The Wealth of Nations, where he postulated all this thing. He was basically really the first economist that started to talk about what an economy does, how it operates, etc. All right, economic systems. Continued. There are three basic production questions that have to be answered in any economy. It doesn't matter what the system is. It doesn't matter whether it's a command system or any kind of system. And that is what and how much to produce, how are we going to produce it, and who are they going to be produced for? Now, those are the questions that are on the production side. Those are the questions that firms have to answer to decide what products they're going to produce, how much of it they're going to produce, how they're going to sell it, etc. So that's their questions. The answers are provided in the market system. For instance, price or market systems like the US. Buyers and sellers meet in a market and they agree on price. Command system, for instance, like the old Soviet Union or Cuba, where the Central Committee decides what's going to be produced, who it's going to be sold to, who's going to build it, etc. Every step of the way, the command system was used in the old Soviet Union to produce all the goods and services for people. Or there's a combination, socialism, or, for instance, China's mixed system. China has a central committee that determines a lot of information, but they've also opened up the western side of their country, or the eastern side rather of the country, to foreign investment. And as a result, they have a mixed economy. They have a central committee, but they also have part of capitalism existing side by side with a central committee or command system. All right, let's talk about the command system. Government owns most or all, most if not all, of economic resources. What this means for individuals in this society is that they do not own anything. They do not own the land they farm. They do not own the apartment or the home they're living in. Everything is owned by the government. Economic activity is determined by a central planning committee. Now, this is interesting. When I took Russian economics in graduate school, it was probably the most boring course I ever took. Every day we had to study a new 5-year plan because the 5-year plan that was put out by the government the year before didn't work, so they had to readjust their 5-year plan. So they kept planning, and really, by the time the Central Committee arrived at the plan and filtered it down through the bureaucracy, the poor guy in the field who had to produce the product had a big problem because he did not really know what the plan was. In addition to that, it was going to change shortly anyway. The plan was executed and enforced at the lowest level through the bureaucracy. The old Soviet Union had a huge bureaucracy and infrastructure that passed information down to its citizens and workers. You know yourself, if you start a rumor at one side of the classroom, by the time it reached the other side, if this person in 20 student classroom, the last person to get it went over and repeated the rumor to you, you wouldn't even recognize it. So as information flows through people, they put their own spin on it. So the most common example, as we said, is the old Soviet Union and its commissars. No longer exists. However, we do have a recent examination of a system that was much like the old Soviet Union and tailored basically as the Soviet Union was. And it was developed under Mao Zedong. So let's take a look at that. Mao defied the production possibilities curve for China. Let's go through what he did. From 1950s through 1970s, he came up with the Great Leap Forward. And his idea was that China would become an industrialized power just like the rest of the world. He intended, in order to accomplish this, now, China at this time is very much an agricultural type of environment. So what he wanted to do was move from agriculture to industrialization. He collectivized the farms. He took over all the land. Government owned all the land. Private farming was prohibitive. and everybody worked on a collective farm, and they produced product for the government who would buy it. To do this and accomplish all of this, people were moved in masses from the farms into the cities to work in factories. Farmers that were left in the fields were assigned quotas and were told how much to produce. This is Mao. He was the great leader. You have to remember what he accomplished, which is pretty spectacular. China, before his rise, was a bunch of warlords, totally disarray. Mao was successful in uniting those people into one country. He had a fight with a conservative Chiang Kai-shek for political systems. He wanted a communist system. Chiang Kai-shek wanted more of a democracy. The two were fighting until the Japanese invaded China. When they invaded China, the two teamed up and worked together to defeat the Japanese. However, after World War II, with the defeat of the Japanese, Mao, when aggressive again, kicked Chiang Kai-shek out of China and on to Formosa, which is now, of course, Taiwan. He was a great leader, but we'll show you in a minute how he was a poor economist. Great leap forward in 1957. His ambitious plan, what he wanted to do was to raise production of agriculture in China, okay, at a high level, a lot of grain, and be able to sell it in the world market for foreign exchange. He would then use that foreign exchange to develop his industrial base. He bragged that in 15 years, China would produce more steel than Great Britain. So what he was trying to do was trade farm products, particularly grain, to produce more of this steel. Now, the problem is you've got to do something. If you're going to produce more or the same amount of grain with fewer people, you've got to do something to make them more productive. So, to finance, what he did was he spent all his money on industrialization and not much on farming. Farmers were told to build backyard furnaces to increase steel production. So not only did he move people off the farm to improve or increase his steel production, but the farmers that were still on the farms were told to build furnaces in the backyard to make steel and increase steel production. Now, if you know anything about how you make steel, you take coke, heat it very, very hot, you put the iron ore in the oven, and it produces molten steel. You pour that into a form, the form that you want the steel to be, whether it's an established form, an ingot, or what. So the key there, though, is now somehow the temperatures in these furnaces on the farms had to be maintained by somebody. So not only were they moving people into the city, not only were they putting backyard furnaces on farms, but those backyard furnaces required people to do less and less farming. Here's a picture of what it looked like. Those pods or towers are steel furnaces in and on farms in China. It resulted in an agricultural failure. Over 1 million people were killed in opposition to this great leap forward. Wheat and grain production fell, but was reported as having risen for fear of reprisals. So these bureaucratic farmers were telling people they were producing a lot more than they actually were. That again was a formula for disaster. The more excess grain production reported, the more Mao shipped overseas. In exchange for, again, he needed good, solid, hard currency, dollars, pounds sterling. All right, communal kitchens were ordered to give grain away free to anyone who wanted it. Thought he had a ton of grain. He did not. In the spring of 1959, the grain was gone. They had bad weather. The arable land was less than ideal, and a full-fledged famine set in. An estimated 15 to 40 million people died in the worst economic disaster in all of world history. Now, we don't know for sure. That's a broad estimate, 15 million to 40 million people. because there was not a lot of reporting of information out of China at this time. Again, it was a command economy, and the information that flowed out of China was controlled by the government. So full-fledged famine set in. There's a picture of people waiting in line trying to get food. And you'll notice in the group that it's for the most part old people and young people. The reason that these people were starved was because they were not productive members of society. They couldn't make steel and they couldn't farm. So young and old alike suffered during this famine. Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. This fell on Mao as a complete and awful disaster. His reaction was, this is not my fault. So what he does, he says, we're going to have a cultural revolution. We are going to bring the students out of school, no more school. We're going to give them guns, and they're going to go around and they're going to take care of people who object to what I'm planning. So his blame was, the failure was because the bourgeoisie, mainly the intellectuals, students, had snuck into the party. Professors, intellectuals, writers, authors, musicians had snuck into the party, and they were the cause of the failure of the Great Leap Forward. So he said, let's go out and destroy the first olds. Old thoughts, old culture, old customs, and old habits. That is a big task in China because people are very grounded in their clan and in their history. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution paralyzed the country, and it sank into anarchy. It ended in 1976 with the death of Mao Zedong. However, fortunately, pragmatists took control of China. Deng and Li came to power. And their theory was, who cares if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse? So they were responsible for keeping the system intact, a command system, but also introducing consumerism into the economy. Okay, Cultural Revolution, sign up. Here's what it looked like. If you were part of this revolution, you carried with you at all times Mao's Red Book. And this Red Book contained the teaching of Mao Zedong. Okay? And you had to have it on your possession, otherwise you were viewed as not part of the program. The price of dissent at this time, not good. Unfortunately, the people who rebelled against it lost their lives. So, what did he do wrong? He was a great leader, political leader, but he ignored the production possibilities curve. So he was a great leader, but not a very good economist. So China had the capability of producing enough wheat to feed their people. Mao wanted to become a world power. Felt the path was to produce more steel. So here's an example of exactly what happened. The opportunity cost for less wheat production and more steel was a famine. And what I'll do is in class next week, I will draw that and how those curves probably looked in the production possibilities curve. So how could he accomplish both? What would he have had to do in order to make his program work? Technology. If you want to accomplish this and you want to move people off the farms, what you have to do is invest in things like farming tractors, fertilizer, anything to get more output per unit of labor. Unfortunately, Mao spent all his money in producing steel. So what he could have done was at the same time when he was moving people into the cities to produce steel, he could have invested in farming to have an increase in output per unit of labor. And that way he could move people off and they could produce more or a higher level of output. All right, let's talk about India. There's another example, production possibilities curve being ignored. India achieved independence from Britain in August 15th, 1947. The British abandoned or left India to home rule. Their economic goals were dominated by ideology of independence and not growth. Now, the people of India were treated poorly by the British. In effect, they absolutely hated the British. And the reason they did was because of the way they were treated as not being equals, and their resources were taken back to the British, to the mother country, to England. And so they felt as though they were taken advantage of and treated poorly. So as a result, they wanted to be autonomous when they got freedom. And they wanted to make sure that they didn't want anything to do with the Western world. They had been subjugated by the British, and they were proud people, but they absolutely hated the British. They had a pain and bitter cultural memory of subjugation under British rule. And this dominated their thinking, not only their political thinking, but also their economic thinking. The imagery of slavery is colorful, but how many Indians felt as slaves? Quite a few. So before reform, Mahatma Gandhi was the political leader who pretty much led them out of the British Empire. And what he believed was that people, the body labor, was the most important thing. Nehru becomes the first prime minister of India. And his comment is, "Never speak to me of profit. It's a dirty word." He wanted nothing to do with profits. He wanted nothing to do with the outside world or the outside economy or the industrialized world. So what he does is he goes to the Soviet Union, and the Soviets show him exactly what they want him to see. How wonderful things are in the Soviet Union and how this system will work for you, Nehru, in India. So he comes back to India in 1951. He writes his first 5-year plan. So he created a license Raj, which stands for reign over. But basically what it means is that if you want to do business in India, you have to have a license. So what ends up happening is that licenses are granted to companies, and they in effect become state monopolies. So once you got a license, you were in good shape. You were protected by the state, you became a monopoly, and unfortunately this fed corruption in India. Now, the economy was closed. They were not allowed to import anything, not even automobiles. And if they did try to import it, the tariffs were high. Some tariffs were as high as 400% of the price. So they closed the economy to the outside world completely. So the government had economic independence. They sought to reach economic independence by protecting and controlling, and they wanted to do everything from inside the country. No outside influence. We can do it ourselves. We don't need them out there. We don't need the US. We don't need Europe. We don't need anybody. We can do it ourselves. They wanted to become economically independent by protecting and controlling everything around the government and the country. So the entire economy was protected from the outside. No capital, no technology investment was allowed. So what had to happen was anything they decided to do had to be funded within their economy. And again, this is a British colony that had just recently achieved independence. So what they did was they protected firms within the economy. Once you got your license, you were golden. So they protected the firms. In effect, they set up monopolies, and nobody could compete with these licensed firms. And they also, at the same time, protected workers from the firms they were protecting. They did some crazy things in terms of labor laws. For instance, if you had over 100 employees, you could never lay anybody off. If you had, for instance, a job with a firm, you could pass that job on to your son or daughter. It had nothing to do with the firm, and the firm could not do it. So go back to the beginning, if you say you can't lay anybody off, you can't fire anybody, why hire them in the first place? So firms in India stayed small, and they stayed under these prohibitive rules. The result was the industries did not have any specialization, and it remained a country that was very fragmented. No specialization, small businesses, small production, considered or closed around their area of expertise. It was a formula for stagnation, and that's exactly what happened in India. Everything stagnated, no growth. So 1950s, 1960s, as part of this process, Nehru nationalizes iron, steel, mining, machine tool manufacture, heavy electrical plants. So what he does is he says everything is going to happen because we're going to take control. In the 1960s, he nationalized cement, textiles, plastics, electronics, drugs, copper, aluminum, scooters, refrigerators, fertilizers, batteries, bread, soda, paper, telecommunications, rare airlines, banking, and insurance. Pretty much got them all owned by the state. When we say nationalized, we mean the state has taken them over. Now, they passed labor laws at the same time that prohibited firing. As I said, jobs could be inherited. You couldn't file bankruptcy if you couldn't make money, and you had to pay overtime and salary whether the employees worked or not. So they ended up having a lot of non-working employees. It was an economic failure. India's quest for self-sufficiency was a miserable failure. The goals and policies resulted in no competition, no freedom, and therefore no incentives to produce. At the end of the day, India traded to being slaves to imperialism, to being slaves to themselves. Excuse me. To grow, India needed more freedom for their people and firms and more resources. But they closed their borders and they were stuck with what they had internally. The failure led to the rise of politicians that supported a more gradual liberalization. So with the end of the Nehru era, they started to liberalize and correct the problems that they had in the country. So they failed to recognize the impact of production possibilities curve. I'll show you this in class, but basically what he did was were he at full employment, his curve would have been higher than what he ended up doing. He shrunk his production possibilities or production frontier curve by closing off the borders, restricting all capital and technology. Doomed to failure. In effect, his actions produced something that was less efficient. So we saw in the case of China that their problem wasn't necessarily efficiency, it was allocation and the cost, the opportunity cost. Here in India, it was efficiency that was the problem. And again, I'm going to draw this in class for you and give you an idea of how it works. So without the help of foreign capital, technology, India was doomed to failure. So in effect, what they did was they resented and hated the British so much that they created a situation in their own country that did not enable them to grow and become part of the industrialized world. And they did it deliberately. The cost was huge. They have since turned it around. They've been growing their economy at about 10% a year, which is very good. So let's go on with economic systems. The market system, which is what we have. This means capitalism or a mixed economy. We have a government, we have a central government. It is centralized, but economic decisions, initiatives are all decentralized and taken on by firms and individuals. The government has a minority role in the evolvement of the economy in a market system. So the key to this system, the key to a market system or a capitalistic system is private ownership. Private ownership doesn't exist in a command system, but in a market economy, private ownership is key. Government does not play a dominant role in the economy. The government influences it. The Federal Reserve influences through interest rates. The federal government influences it through taxation and spending, but neither dominates the economy. So the founding fathers were very smart. When they established our country, they didn't want a king again. Most of these people had flown from Europe to start a new world. And so they created a system of government that requires other people to be looking over the shoulder of different organizations. So therefore, we have an executive branch, which is the president. We have a judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and the courts below it. And we have congressional branches of government, which is the Congress, which is comprised of the House and the Senate. The House being from a lot of people from different districts around the states, the Senate being 2 representatives from each state. Senators, I believe, have a term of 6 years. Congressmen have to run again for election every 2 years. And we're going to talk about that system and how it works. Capitalism continued. Private property is the most important part of capitalism. And understand that while we are individuals, we also have a legal person in a corporation. So people can do things themselves, and people can do things as a group or as an organization. And that's called a corporation. It's a legal entity, legal person. And the key is we can own property, which enables us to take risks, spend money, do innovation, because we will benefit from the fruits of our efforts. If we couldn't benefit from it, like in the Soviet system, why would we innovate? Why would we take risks? There'd be no benefit to us. So this is crucial. Owning private property is crucial to capitalism. So even though you're not an entrepreneur, the members of our society do entrepreneurial things. You may not own a home, but you have a lease for an apartment. Nobody can take it away from you. You may not own a house or car, but you know what? You can make economic decisions for yourself. Even if it's as simple as going to Starbucks in the morning to get your coffee or going to Chick-fil-A to get a chicken sandwich, which to me sounds horrible. All right. Property rights are key also for intellectual properties. And we protect, under capitalism systems, property rights and intellectual property by patents and copyright law. A patent pertains mainly to an idea which evolves into a product, a physical product. Most patents are given for physical products. Copyrights generally are applied to intellectual property. For instance, the textbook that you have for this course. So copyright law primarily pertains to published articles and books. All right, other characteristics of the system. An active but limited government. We have the freedom of enterprise and choice. We can make a decision as to what we're going to do, what we're going to buy, what we're going to build, and what we're going to do in the future in terms of our education and our work. We are driven by self-interest. Right? There's nothing wrong with self-interest. Right? We want to succeed on our own. We're driven by competition. We compete with one another. You guys are competing with one another for grades. In the marketplace, corporations compete with one another for sales of products, which generate revenue. Markets and prices, a place. Now, markets are an interesting thing. They may not be physical because they could be the internet now. So we have two kinds of markets basically, a physical market and an invisible market. The physical markets, of course, would be your um, local store, your donut shop, your dry cleaners, anybody who has a business for himself and operates and sells products or services from that business location. Um, that's a major problem today. The brick and mortar companies are suffering. JCPenney, Sears, etc. Amazon is doing fantastically because people go to these bricks and mortar places, look at what they want to buy, then they go home on the internet, go to Amazon and buy it on the internet. Technology and capital goods are critical. Technology is what grows an economy. Technology enables us to produce capital goods, which is machinery and equipment, to produce more goods more effectively and more cheaply. Again, for a business, he who has the lowest cost wins. Specialization. It enables us to specialize. Think about in the old days in the agricultural environment, you had to produce everything yourself. The food you ate, the coal you burned in your furnace, the lumber you cut down for your fireplace, you had to do everything yourself. Today, we specialize in a particular field, labor or human specialization. And we specialize and we get paid to do what we do. We use that money to buy the services that we used to do directly for ourselves 100, 200 years ago. Okay, and then the key, money, 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 money. Money facilitates transactions. We define it as a medium of exchange because it's accepted by everyone. We're going to do a session on money and how it operates and how it affects the economy. But basically, for this stage, we define money as a medium of exchange, accepted by everyone. When we say a medium of exchange, we mean it's accepted by everyone. Socialism. There's a cartoon I found. Guy comes up, says, "You spare change?" Says, "Sure." Reaches into his neighbor's pocket and takes money out of his pocket and gives it to the beggar. Socialism. Socialism is a quasi. It's considered in many cases to be more political than economic. The concept of wealth redistribution, eliminate income disparity between the wealthy and the poor. This is the key tenet of socialism. We want to be sure that we take care of as many people as we possibly can in our society. So what we try to do is to reduce the disparity between the wealthy and the poor. In this country, we use what's called a progressive tax system. The more you make, the more you pay in taxes. This has become more popular in the European countries after World War II. They had to rebuild their economies. They had to give people a lot of things, but they needed to control some of the key industries like telephone, telegraph, rail, cars, railroads, these things, post office. They needed to control these things after World War II, so they adopted a more socialistic system. A lot of that has been broken down since then. Now, there are macroeconomic issues with these types of things. The government has to own and run large industries like rail, utilities, etc. They also pass very strict labor laws, mandatory vacations, severance pay, work week limitations. They are very, very strict in Europe. I found that out when I worked for the old Burroughs Corporation. We tried to close a plant in Ireland, and we had to pay a bunch of money out to people for the next year, even though we were producing nothing in Ireland. Okay, there's a socialist. Capitalism sucks slogan. Printed t-shirts, caps, mugs, stickers, sold 4 million items each in 24 countries and made 15 million bucks. People in a socialistic society sometimes tend to gravitate more towards capitalism. So there are 5 fundamental questions that a market system must answer. Number 1, what products will be produced? The goods and services that people are going to buy. McDonald's has had some winners and losers. Now, the price, the profits, the products that don't have a low cost will not continue to be sold. So profitable products are sold, unprofitable products are discontinued. The revenue, the sum of all sales, less the cost, salary, wages, and interest, equals the profit that the firm will make. So the firm says, this is what I'm going to produce because I want to make a profit, and hopefully somebody's going to buy it. Consumer sovereignty. This is where we come in. We determine what those companies are going to produce by our dollar votes. When we spend $1 on a product, we are voting for that product that we want it, we like it, and continue to make it because we do want it and like it. Consumer sovereignty is buyers with dollar votes. Number 2, how are the goods and services going to be produced? Production will be based on a least cost method. Whoever can produce the product at the lowest cost will be the winner. Production will take place using resources: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability. Again, the entrepreneur is the one that puts all this stuff together to create a product that is the least cost product in the marketplace. The lowest cost product means he can offer it at the lowest price and still make a profit. That's the key to the system. So, dominant factors are technology and the price of resources applied. So, what does he pay for land, labor, capital? How much technology is he able to apply to its product? In other words, buy capital equipment to produce more at a cheaper cost. Number 3, who gets the output? Here's where we come in. Those with the ability to pay. We have to make money. We have to be able to buy the output from firms. The amount of income the consumer makes depends on what he will buy. If you got a lot of money, you buy the Mercedes. If you're limited and watching your budget, you buy the Ford. Price of the product. Price of the product is very key. If it's not priced properly, we're not going to buy it, and the producer is going to have to stop producing it. Now, we also do things based on preference. And sometimes we do things for preference reasons, even though they cost us more money. Maybe we'll have to go out and take out a loan. If we prefer the Mercedes over the Ford and we're going to have the Mercedes, we will go to whatever lengths and extremes we have to get that Mercedes. That's called consumer preference. Later on in the chapter, we'll talk about consumer preference and indifference curves. In class, remind me of this, and I'll show you what that means in a graph. So, the demand for the product, this is key. So if you look at the producer, he is the one producing the product and selling it in the marketplace. If you look at the consumer, that's us. So when we talk about demand and consumers, we're talking about us. When we talk about price, we're talking about consumers. Number 4, how will the system accommodate change? Without government intervention, the marketplace will force its own change. Consumer preferences will drive demand to products that we desire and the price that we'll pay for it. We're not going to pay more for it than it's worth, in our opinions. So our preferences determine what's going to be produced and how the marketplace is going to react. So consumer preferences will determine what product we produce, and therefore the profitability of that company, and therefore they will be in a position to continue production. Number 5, how will a system promote progress? Technological advance occurs through creative destruction. We can't hold on to old things. We can't keep doing things the way we used to. Just look at what's happened in the field of technology. We were dependent upon an analog clock where the hands go around. All of a sudden, we discovered that we could digitize that. And now you look at your cell phone, it comes up with a date and time. That is a digital appearance. It's no longer hands on a clock going around and around. We, in effect, did away with that. It's glamorous today because it represents some of the old stuff. But today, you look at your cell phone to get the time of day. I don't wear a watch anymore because I don't need it. If I need to know what time it is, I can find out what time it is, what day it is, what date it is, just by looking at my cell phone. So people have to innovate. The watch companies that make wristwatches are hurting. The companies that produce iPhones and Samsung are doing very well, Apple and Samsung. Technology changes, and you have to allow that destruction to take place. If, for instance, you try to hang on to something, an industry, and so government steps in and supports it, it will end up costing the taxpayers more and more money. You have to allow creative destruction to take place. So, companies will accumulate capital by selling their products. Now, they'll sell products that they can make money on, but they have to remember, and we're going to talk about the curve called the bell curve that shows that if you want to produce products and stay in business, nothing lasts forever. You've got to be innovative. Take a look at what Apple did starting out with the iPad, no, not the iPad, excuse me, the iPod for music, going to the cell phone, which was the 4, migrating to the 5, the 6, the 7. Each of them new products, each of them continuing the company at a profitable basis. Classic example. All right, let's recap everything we just went through. Pure capital does not exist anywhere today. Laissez-faire, Adam Smith, 1776, doesn't exist anywhere today. Market system, a variation, that's us. Limited role of the government. Now, one of the things to be careful of, don't confuse capitalism or the market system with political systems. It's not. Democracy and the market system or capitalism are not the same thing. Communism and command systems are not the same thing. The only one that comes close to being the same is socialism. And I'm not going to confuse you with a question on socialism. Command system, the government makes all the fundamental decisions, owns all the property, no private property or property rights. Okay? Classic example, again, is the Soviet Union, which in 1991, I believe, the Berlin Wall came down, and the command system in the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Okay, so that's chapter 2. And I will send this off to you again. It will be an announcement on the website, on Blackboard.